I think Gorillapark's sculpture is really interesting. So when I look at this, I immediately think, okay, this is a wooden carved sculpture, and it's highly ornate. It has a really textured relief carving, which required a lot of manual skill to create both the really smooth forms of this almost alien biomorphic figure, as well as the background that has this amazing repeating texture, which I think is really, it's almost hypnotic. So you have this wooden element, and then you can imagine that took a really long time to create, a lot of effort. And that's really contrasted by this really quick spray painted figure, the stick figure that's drawn on top of it. And you think of a stick figure and you think of, a quick sketch on a piece of paper, but here it's huge, it's overlapping the entire figure, or the entire alien figure that we have in the background, and there's this weird sort of dichotomy. You only recognize the stick figure when you're standing directly in front of the sculpture. When you move to the side, the lines no longer connect, and you can no longer tell what exactly the colorful elements of this work are. And I think that is really interesting too, that it sort of encourages you to move around and engage with the work from multiple different directions. I also think it's interesting because in using these two different modes of working, both carving and spray paint, which I associate with a lot of graffiti art, he's also combining very different historical references. Woodworking, wood carving is something that humans have been doing for millennia. It's something that has a really deep history, and of course in Japan also has a very specific history. And then sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum is graffiti, which is something that's done really quickly. It's often very transgressive. The idea that he's adding graffiti to his own sculpture, defacing the ornate specificity of the carved elements, I think is really interesting, and is definitely very attention-grabbing. I think that this is a really interesting nexus. I also feel like when I look at this, I'm also reminded of a lot of surrealist artists like Max Ernst through the very biometric forms of this carved relief. I feel like there's a lot of potential to continue exploring the tension between carving and drawn elements, and I think playing with scale and working at a really large scale would be really interesting as well. I think it's really interesting that Gorillapark has pointed to science fiction and film, specifically science fiction film, as being really influential in his work. And actually, he's talked about how 2001: A Space Odyssey, that Kubrick film, the monolith in that film as being something that has influenced his work. And I think that's really interesting because when I immediately look at this, I think of the deep history of carved relief sculpture. I think Gorillapark's work is really interesting. I mean, the fact that it speaks to so many different influences, from science fiction, film, surrealism, graffiti, to the history of carved relief wooden sculpture, really, I think, brings something new to the table, something that I haven't seen before, and something that's really intriguing. I could see this work in so many different contexts as well, from a museum context to, putting this in something totally different, like in a public space or even in a temple, and thinking about what that dynamic between new and old is. So yeah, this is a work that really, I think, leaves us with a lot of questions, and I think good art is something that makes us ask questions.